It's out there. It's so crystal clear to me.
It's not that the society is socially conservative and they're rejecting you. They're rejecting you because you're an outsider.
Yeah. Moral courage and integrity are at the heart of what I always thought we did in the military.
Has it made you revisit what your experience in the 34 years serving the British Army was like?
I say to people, be on the right side of history. And all those people that are, cheerleading the IDF now, when it is declared a genocide, how are you going to feel about yourself? How are you going to look yourself in the eye? They've made it completely unlivable. They have created the conditions whereby it is almost impossible for 2 million Palestinians to exist.
Whoever else is coming into Afghanistan to kind of fix that are going to be seen as this invading colonial other entity and are going to be resisted by almost all parts of society, if not physically, then at least emotionally or psychologically.
We created the insurgency, which eventually defeated us.
Testing 1, 2, 3.
Charlie Herbert, can you hear me okay? Testing 1, 2, 3. Good.
It sounded very military.
That's me. Can't change that, I'm afraid.
Okay, I'm just going to clap and then we'll start. 3, 2, 1. Hi, good day and welcome to another episode of Unapologetic. I'm very pleased today to be joined by Major General Charlie Herbert.
Thank you. No, it's a real privilege to be on, sir. Thank you for asking me here today.
Thank you. Those of you who are not familiar with Charlie Herbert's Twitter or his previous interviews, he's been an extremely outspoken, morally clear voice against Israel's atrocities in Gaza for a long while, but especially over the last 2 years of Israel's genocide. So you're here today because I think your perspective is interesting. As a former Major General in the British Army, we were just discussing as you were walking in, sort of why is it that so many members of the military establishment, past or present, seem to not have the clarity you do. You obviously didn't want to take the side of saying I have more clarity than them, but from my perspective, why is it that you think differently to them?
That's a really interesting question. And I can't speak on behalf of them, of course. I can only give you... in terms of those people who are still serving, they're not able to comment. And you see that they don't comment. And even very senior officers find themselves unable to comment. The MOD press office just won't allow them to do so. It's too politically sensitive. Why don't more veterans speak out? That's a really kind of interesting question. And I spend a lot of time over the last couple of years sort of considering that. And I chuck stuff out on LinkedIn to my ex-military network just to kind of see what the take-up is. And it's remarkable how many people don't want to engage in what I think is a relatively black and white issue here. Why is that? I don't know. A lot of ex-military people go and work for the defence industry, and I think they feel incapable or unwilling to speak out, particularly if they're going to speak out in any negative way about the Israeli Defence Force. That's not going to be good for their career or their business prospects. Others, I'm slightly baffled by. We spend a lot of time in the military talking about the law, international law. We talk about ethics. We talk about values and standards. We live by a particular code of values and standards, loyalty, self-discipline, all of these things. And moral courage and integrity are at the heart of what I always thought we did in the military, particularly in the army. And, I am slightly dismayed at the number of people who seem incapable of looking at what has gone on in Gaza over the last 2 years and seem incapable of coming up with an objective view on it. Many people, they just seem willing to excuse the Israeli Defence Forces of everything that they may do, irrespective of the illegality of it. And I find that staggering. I didn't set out to be a critic of Israel or the Israeli Defence Forces. I set out 2+ years ago to be a commentator. And my initial posts and my initial engagements with the media were really more about cautioning Israel about avoiding the same mistakes that the United States and her allies, including the UK, made after 9/11. And it was pretty clear that after the 7th of October that Israel were going to lash out violently in retribution and in anger, and one can understand that to a certain extent. But the danger with doing that is one very quickly loses one's moral compass. And we saw exactly that with the United States after 9/11. We saw the incidents of Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo. We saw instances with UK forces in southern Iraq after 2003. It's very easy when one is angry and when one is blind and when one goes into this kind of military approach without thinking strategically, without thinking about the political outcomes, that actually you just become the monster that you seek to destroy. And that is exactly what Israel did. And they fell for it, hook, line, and sinker. So I didn't seek to criticize them at the beginning. I just seek to comment objectively, on what I thought Israel should do sensibly and logically and strategically in response to the events of the 7th of October. I wasn't a commentator on Israel and Palestine before the 7th of October. I'd visited Israel. I've never been to Gaza. I am by no means an expert. Absolutely not an expert. I have some experience in the military. Spent 34 years in the army, but limited experience in Israel and Palestine. Spent a lot of time in the Middle East, of course. But yeah, I found myself, certainly by January 2024, what sort of 2 to 3 months in, I found myself absolutely mortified, horrified by the Israeli response, by what I viewed as a military campaign that was lacking in distinction between combatants and civilians, was lacking in proportionality. Aspects of it were grossly illegal. So I found myself moving from an objective commentator to a fairly fierce critic of what I saw, and that hasn't changed. I've become more critical.
So you mentioned becoming more critical, and I think it's been so long. The actual do you believe it's a genocide? Because I'm about to say the genocide's been unfolding. Do you think it's a genocide or? Okay.
It's hard to say it's not a genocide, isn't it? It's
it
really
absolutely isn't.
difficult
Yes.
to look you in the eye and say, I don't think this looks like a genocide. I can't rule legally, and it's going to take until the end of 2027, 2028, until we get the ICJ ruling. Watch this. I say to people, be on the right side of history. And all those people that are, cheerleading the IDF now, when it is declared a genocide, how are you going to feel about yourself? How are you going to look yourself in the eye in the future?
Okay. Because it's been 2 years of an unfolding genocide, we often, the human mind it's wired to remember the most recent thing. And so it may be difficult for us to grapple with how long we've been seeing atrocities, because initially the atrocities were we were seeing buildings and buildings were going up in smoke. And we saw kids being pulled to the hospital and, often really gruesome sights. Unfortunately, blood everywhere. And then we kind of saw rubble and people starving and people running and getting shot. And, through that process, there was a lack of aid being given. We saw people being, really, some of them emaciated. There's been a lot of controversy in the media that a lot of those people were completely emaciated, had pre-existing conditions. We did see a lot of, thin and impoverished people in Gaza. So I think that's not up for debate at all. And now you see a militarization of the entire Gaza Strip, been divided into two. We've seen Israel trying to unleash sort of civil disturbance within Israel, within Gaza by sort of arming gangs. So there's been all sorts of games, and we just see the most recent atrocity we see. So, for example, when you came in, again, we were speaking about the fact that there were 2 young people in Jenin, Palestinians, who were just shot last night. In your own words, and you also mentioned that as this has gone on, you've become even more critical of Israel's behavior, which I think is just the norm for everyone who's become critical of Israel. But just walk us through, in your mind, which were some of the moments which stand out for you, both calculated and random, as just what is this? Like, how do we have this level of barbarity in the 21st century?
It's extraordinary. I think there's a danger that we just view this as a conflict of the last 2 years. And we fail to put this into its historical context of the last 80-odd years. I think it's a really important thing. This is just one act in a continuum of violence that has been going on since the late 1940s, through the 1960s, the 70s, the 80s, war against Gaza. And there's a real danger that we only look at it through the prism of Gaza. And that's a massive mistake. And I think this is Trump's fundamental mistake. He's failing to understand a much wider Arab-Israeli issue here, a much wider Palestinian issue, statehood, occupation, etc. That's my kind of first point. Controversially, I would argue that Israel had an inherent right to self-defense on the 7th of October. Many people would legally argue that they didn't necessarily because of the nature of the occupation, and there are some compelling grounds there. But I would say, as a state, Israel had a right to self-defense on the 7th of October. I would have urged, if I had been an advisor to Netanyahu and his Israeli, I would have urged them to take a long-term political approach to this conflict, and to place the use of the military instrument as part of just one instrument. This needs a long-term diplomatic approach. But it required a military approach. There was no doubt about that. But at the end of October, or from the 7th of October, Israel was going to use military force to try to bring about some level of destruction on Hamas. That was inevitable. And had they adopted a proportionate counter-terrorist approach, to target the leadership of Hamas, to target those that took part on the 7th of October or involved in the planning. I think that we could have understood that. What was fundamentally wrong is this business of proportionality and distinction. And by the end of by November, I mean, we saw this just staggeringly disproportionate air campaign. Whole areas, whole residential accommodation blocks being destroyed by the Israeli Air Force. So from the very, very outset, it was looking wrong. It was looking abhorrent. It was looking like a grossly disproportionate response. I mean, the time for me when I thought, this is just off the pale was probably about late December, early January 2024, when photographs were coming out of Gaza by some very, very brave journalists, Palestinian journalists working inside Gaza. Photographs were coming out of large groups of Palestinian men of fighting age, by which I mean anywhere from the age of 18 to 60, who had been detained by the Israeli Defense Forces and were being held on their knees, often stripped down to their underpants. They had their hands behind their heads. And I just thought, this just kind of looks wrong. We didn't do mass detentions like this in Iraq and Afghanistan against civilians. And then, these they were mistreated. The stories that were coming out of a level of mistreatment, extrajudicial killings which were going on. Some of the footage which was coming out in early 2024. It was just kind of staggering. It just looked like a bloodfest that the IDF were on. And anybody, I think, at that stage would start to realise that this was just fundamentally wrong. Wherever one sat on the political spectrum, this was just fundamentally wrong. And if you just take that aside, it's illogical. It is strategically illogical, strategically illiterate what the Israelis are doing here. This is in no way, that conflict, the last 2 years, is in no way going to bring about a better peace. It's guaranteeing another generation of conflict between Palestine and Israel. It's absolutely guaranteeing it. And that doesn't make any sense. There was a moment, I thought, after the 7th of October, there was a once-in-a-generation moment for Israel to try to take stock of what had happened, and for Israel to collectively as a nation try to understand the roots of Palestinian discontent and resistance, and to look themselves in the mirror and to use this as an opportunity to try to address the root causes of a conflict that has been going on for the last 70 years, to address the issues of occupation, to address the issues of Palestinian statehood. But they chose not to do that. They absolutely chose to ignore that, in favour of a violent, genocidal, disproportionate military campaign that serves absolutely no long-term purpose or good, as far as I can see. And then, at every sort of stage along the way, we've seen further evidence of Israeli crimes. I mean, I think the ICJ genocide case, if that didn't make people sit up and take notice, nothing would. I think the ICC arrest warrants against Netanyahu and Gallant and others, again, would make anybody sit up and take notice. You can't ignore those international bodies. You cannot just choose to ignore, those multilateral bodies that were set up in the 1940s, post-war, to prevent this kind of conflict from having happen again. You cannot avoid the really prominent Jewish voices that are out there that are labelling this as a genocide. You see these extraordinary people on the marches in London, Holocaust survivors and children of Holocaust survivors, who have the moral courage and the clarity to come out and march against what they see as this awful war. It's out there. It's so crystal clear to me that this war was unlawful, it's being prosecuted in a genocidal manner, and it's strategically illiterate, and it will bring no good. It just creates another generation of conflict.
So you mentioned that it's strategically illiterate. You've mentioned it will bring a generation of conflict. I completely agree with that. But I think there are those on the I would have said 2 years ago on the extreme right of Israel, but now I think it's a large portion of Israel who would argue that for them, from their perspective, this is strategically illiterate because they are kind of creating they are going to try to ethnically cleanse and make it extremely difficult for Palestinians to even ever think of resistance. Now, I do think that people who are occupied will always think of resistance. But I think Israel reached the point, not in a calculated way, just organically. If you look at the development since the 1940s, where there was an attempt at ethnic cleansing, and then a skirting of providing the Palestinians with a state for a long time, and then occupation or in 1967 of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, or initially an annexation from Jordan and Egypt, and then an occupation. And so there'll be those in Israel, and Ben Gvir and Smotrich, and now even Netanyahu best represent that, where it's like we are just going to actually mute the entire issue by ethnically cleansing or genociding to ethnic cleanse. Killing as many people so that people feel that we rather leave. And so from their perspective, this is it. You see, I think we most of the people in the world have been socialized post-1940s to be like, we need to kind of get along. There's a lot of historical injustices, but we kind of have to abide by international law. And that, even if it's structurally unfair, will be, will kind of minimize fallout. And I think that's been the approach of international relations. But Israel have decided, and I think the key thing is they've obviously been given a license to behave, some would say surprisingly, some would say unsurprisingly, in this way where we are actually going to try to push out. Last night, settlers by themselves went into Syria and started building a settlement in Syria. And so I think that the Israeli society and its military leadership and its civil leadership have decided that this is strategically what they want to do. They want to make it extremely difficult to have Palestinian existence. And what's your response to that?
I don't disagree with a word you said, but I mean, you're absolutely right. My argument that I put forward earlier sort of presupposes that Israel want peace with their Palestinian neighbours. And that's a big assumption, isn't it? I think there are many people in Israel that would like that. There are many decent Israelis that would like that. But you're absolutely right. Smotrich, Ben Gvir, Netanyahu, the far right over there, absolutely not interested. I think you're right. They saw the events of the 7th of October as an opportunity to justify exactly what you have just described there, the expulsion of the Palestinians, Nakba 2, Nakba 3, whatever you want to call it. No, absolutely right. And there's no doubt what they've done to Gaza, they've made it completely unlivable. They have created the conditions whereby it is almost impossible for 2 million Palestinians to exist. And what's really sad is this so-called 20-point peace plan is not going to make that any better. It's going to make it worse. So you're right. We've sort of, people have fallen into the trap of probably what the Israeli political far right sought, come the 7th of October. And there are some people that will tell you that the Israelis, it was convenient for them to have what happened on the 7th of October because it provided that pretext to enable them to do this. I don't buy into that. I think it was a massive intelligence failure, a massive security failure, a bit like 9/11, intelligence and a security failure. But they have used it as a pretext to conduct, what they have done over the last 2 years and will continue to do so. And what really worries me is that this, I can't even call it a peace plan. It's not a peace plan. It's a frozen conflict. That's all that's happened. It's a frozen conflict that appears to allow the Israeli Defense Forces to continue their forever war against the people of Gaza. And that is absolutely what Netanyahu wants. Netanyahu doesn't want an end to this conflict. I totally agree with you. He's never wanted an end to this conflict. I think many in Israeli society don't want an end to this conflict. It's a country that was formed in the crucible of fire and war from 1948 onwards. It's harsh to say. It's a country that almost needs perpetual conflict and war. And I feel harsh saying that, but I have concluded this over the last few years, but that's kind of where it is. If it ever found peace with its neighbours, and a lot of the funding that it gets from the United States, a lot of the support that it gets from around the world would probably dry up, and that would not be healthy for the political state of Israel. So, it's kind of difficult. I like to think good of most people, and I kind of like to think that the majority of Israelis would like to live in some form of peaceful coexistence with the Palestinians and would like to find a solution that allows that, whether that is a one-state solution, I don't think that's feasible, or whether that is some kind of two-state solution, but it's really difficult to work out what that would look like today.
Okay, I mean, I polls in Israeli society taken by Haaretz in the last sort of 6 or 7 months have because I too believed, and I still like to hope, that there are many people in Israel who would want a peaceful solution. I think the poll was that 47% believe that the Israeli army had a right to kill everyone who it occupies. and about 82% believe that Palestinians should be ethnically cleansed. So I mean, and this is the Israeli Jewish society, not the entire Israeli society, which 20% is sort of Palestinian, what Israelis call Israeli Arabs. So I mean, maybe that's just a wartime poll. Maybe when things kind of calm down, or now that it's 7 months old, maybe that would change. But that's just a poll from an extremely credible news organization, Haaretz. You mentioned that round about January, and that's when the ICJ, when the actual hearing was taking place. That's when you were like, this is actually just beyond the pale, and you don't understand what's going on. Did you expect? And I guess the answer is yes, but let's maybe I like sort of go through it a bit more. But did you expect a stronger intervention from the international community at some point? When did you think it was like? Did you were you sitting there thinking, I just can't understand why Biden is still sending weapons? And when you were thinking that, what was the calculus in your head, and when was this moment?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I predicted in October 2023, incorrectly predicted, that this would be a relatively short war. Yeah, Israel has only ever fought short wars. It has a doctrine of short wars that end quite quickly, after a matter of weeks or months. And I cited in numerous interviews the sort of a war against Lebanon in 2006, which the United States supported and condoned for about 31 days before they pulled the plug on it. And I thought that the United States would allow Israel to enact its revenge upon Hamas for about 2 to 3, maybe 4 or 5 months. And then I thought the US support would dry up. I thought US domestic support for it would completely dry up. And I thought European support for this conflict would kind of dry up. And I thought everybody by early 2024 would see that this was just inherently wrong and needed to stop. And I can't understand. I just cannot understand how first this Conservative government of ours and then this Labour government of ours has continued to not just support politically what's going on in Israel, but has actually been complicit in it. Whether that is flights from Cyprus, Royal Air Force aircraft, flying over Gaza, hoovering up intelligence, apparently to support hostage rescue. I don't really buy into that. Whether that is us providing, military support, whether that's us providing arms, material, funding, political support in the United Nations to Israel, I don't understand it. I just don't. My trust, I think as a nation, I think the UK and young people in particular, their trust in government in general, is completely shattered by this. They've seen 2 successive UK governments that have blindly supported Israel in the face of all of the evidence that said that they shouldn't, against a public that have come out week after week and marched against UK support for this conflict. But the government's just ignored us. It's completely ignored us. And it beggars belief. I mean, people say similar thing happened with the Iraq War in 2003. 1 million people marched against the war, and the government still went ahead with it. But that was over a relatively kind of short period of time. This has been over 2 years, and it's kind of heartbreaking. You start to question, what more can one do? What more can one do? And I think this is this sort of weird kind of time and place now where we have pensioners who are prepared to go to Parliament Square and get themselves arrested because they are so disgusted by the actions of this government. I mean, that is extraordinary. That is really telling. People with unblemished records, their whole life, people of upstanding reputations, teachers, former police officers, former military officers even, who've gone out there and are willing to get arrested, because they are so unhappy, so distraught in many respects about this government's support for what they view as a deeply illegal war. It's hard to explain. I wish I could succinctly explain what's kind of happening. But, the idea that this is democracy is a farce. It's not a democracy. We're living in an authoritarian state. It's closing down political opposition to this war. The banning of the prescription of Palestine action, the deliberate banning, intentional banning of political opposition. That's all it was. People should see that. It isn't about Israel. It isn't about Gaza. It's about the banning of a political opposition. And again, I think this has broken the public's trust and confidence in government. I really do. We're in a really bad place at the moment as a country, I think.
Okay, you mentioned, the prescription of Palestine action in your view is just the banning of political opposition. I mean, it's interesting because ruling parties would have so many things they would like to ban so that they could, be more comfortable or stay in power. And obviously, there's been a lot of noise around, the UK complicity, or what protesters believe it's UK complicity in Israel's atrocities, or even if it wasn't that, just the sort of outrage at Israel's atrocity in itself. Why is it that from all the fights that the government could have chosen to fight, or do or behave in a very deceptive way, or in a very suspicious way, why this?
$1 million question, isn't it? I mean, wouldn't one love to be a fly on the wall, in some of these cabinet meetings, or some of the meetings that take place in Number 10 and in other parts of Westminster? I don't know, the power of the pro-Israel lobby across the Atlantic in the United States, I always realised was strong. I don't think I'd realised quite how strong it was, but it is strong, and one only has to look at what's publicly available in the levels of funding from AIPAC give to US politicians to buy their votes and their support. What I hadn't realised is quite how powerful that lobby was here in the United Kingdom, and the last 2 years I think has exposed that to me. It's the only possible explanation for what seemed to be illogical political decisions and outcomes. The prescription of Palestine action. I mean, why has so much political capital been wasted on that? Because of huge pressure being applied to this government to do so. It's just, it doesn't make any kind of sense. And where does it go next? It's really interesting. I think like everybody, I'm shattered, I think, by the power of this unseen lobby that seems to so malignly shape and influence UK policy at the moment, UK politics and policy. It's extraordinary, and there's sort of really pernicious impact on the media. Daily Telegraph went after me about 18 months ago and ran a kind of smear piece on me. They dragged up a story from about 7 years ago, completely non-story. Yeah, one
This is the one where you were having champagne with some people.
Yeah, drinking champagne in Kabul, and I was sent home early. Big deal. Non-story. 6-7 years ago. Is that really a story in the public interest? You only had to look at the comments on the Daily Telegraph website that day, as everybody said, this is just a really dirty, nasty smear campaign. This is a punishment beating for Charlie Herbert.
Yeah, no, I came across it when doing some research on you, and I was like, what is this?
But our media, they've played a really, really dangerous part in this, and a hugely, almost inexplicable, I think, to a certain extent. They seem incapable of calling out. So I was surprised, actually. So you mentioned the shooting dead of the two, what was quite clearly a murder of two Palestinians in Jenin a day or two ago, and it's been splashed all over the media. And lots of people predicted on social media that the BBC wouldn't run that story, it would just disappear it. But I was surprised to see the story was on BBC social media this morning. I'm surprised, because normally they would bury any kind of story like that. Yeah, they've played a really bad part in this campaign.
Okay. So I mean, look, it's very clear that to anyone who's been listening to you or seeing you, that your stance on this comes from a place of moral clarity, comes from a place of being, enraged, upset about atrocities. You did serve in the British Army for 34 years, I think, right? When you see what has happened in the last 2 years, and I'm sure you had your own reflections even while serving, has it made you revisit what your experience in the 34 years serving the British Army was like? Like, what's it? Do you think that and say, was I sometimes, because you see, I come from what was once called the third world, now called the developing world. I come from South Africa. And in my mind, and in most South Africans' minds who aren't white, and it's not just South Africans, it's when I travel to India or Egypt or any place which was previously colonized, the idea was like the US Army first, and then the British Army are just these evil entities, right? And that comes from a legacy of 300-400 years. So when you see the last 2 years and what's occurred, does it make you rethink? And I've heard you say, and I don't think it's without credence, that you got involved in the army because of the idea of service, but also for humanitarian reasons. And I can see from your perspective, why that was the intention. But when you see the last 2 years and you reflect over your service in the last 34 years, which we'll get to in more in-depth later on, does it make you rethink what it was all about?
Not really. I mean, if I'm being honest, not really. I'm very happy to talk about the Iraq War. I think mistakes were made, and I was a MOD planner in 2003, involved in planning, for the invasion of Iraq, and I'm happy to kind of take questions about it. I think there were some gross strategic errors made there and mistakes. Overall, though, I still believe in the nobility of the armed forces. I still believe that they are a deeply honourable institution. And I still believe that they do considerably more good than bad. I absolutely believe that. I think there are failures in how they're employed sometimes, but they tend to be political failures rather than failures of the military itself. And I'm not saying that there aren't some bad apples in every single organisation, whether that's the United States Army or whether that's British Army. And it's really important that where transgressions or illegal actions take place, that they are dealt with appropriately and that people are punished and, if convicted, sentenced appropriately, and we have seen that, during my time in the army. My career is characterised by support to the police in Northern Ireland. I'm very proud of what I did, very proud of what we did to eventually bring about a long-term political accommodation solution to Northern Ireland. In the 1990s, I was very much involved in the wars in the Balkans. I'm very proud of what I did there. We were there to enable the delivery of humanitarian aid to the civilians who were caught up in an atrocious war. And it's very sad, but a number of British soldiers lost their lives in providing that humanitarian aid. I was very involved in the campaign in Afghanistan. After 2001, I did 3 tours in Afghanistan and various tours in the Ministry of Defence supporting that campaign. I still believe that it was the right thing to do. I absolutely do. It was a flawed experiment in nation building, but I think everybody who served there had the right intentions. I genuinely believed that we were trying to do good. I genuinely believed it was the right thing to try to bring about a better form of democracy. I thought it was the right thing to try and support and enable equal rights, education for girls, jobs for women. I still believe that was the right thing to do. Maybe what we did was overly ambitious, and maybe mistakes were along the way. I still think we were right to fight a war against the Taliban initially. I thought they were an abhorrent organisation when we overthrew them in 2001, an absolutely abhorrent organisation. And the Afghans were delighted to see them go. What went wrong was, over the period of 20 years, we should have realised earlier that we were caught up in a civil war, and that we were ultimately supporting a side that was deeply corrupt, Hamid Karzai and Ashraf Ghani. So I think, by the time it came to leave in 2021, it was right, but we left. I struggled with that decision at the time, but I look back on it now. But no, I'm very proud of what we did in Afghanistan, and I'm very sad that 457 soldiers, lost their lives over there, doing what they thought was the right thing and trying to make it a better place. Iraq's an interesting one, so I say, in late 2002, I was working in the Ministry of Defence. I was a young major in my early 30s. And like many people, I saw what became known as the dodgy dossier, the weapons of mass destruction intelligence. And what I saw looked credible enough to me. I didn't question it. Maybe I was naive. And I think many of us were kind of caught up in that. And through 2002 and early into 2003, I genuinely thought that Tony Blair, the then president, was riding on the coattails of the United States, George Bush, so that he could exercise some kind of positive influence over the decision to go to war, whether or not we went to war, and the way in which that war was then prosecuted. And that was naive of me. I think Bush and Blair were always going to go to war in March 2003. I didn't realise that. And I don't think the UK were capable of in any way influencing the US conduct of that war. And we unleashed a Pandora's box of problems, which continue to this day. So the war in Iraq was wrong, and I think no sane person would deny that now. It was the wrong thing to do. It was based on false intelligence. Part of it, I think, stemmed back to 9/11, and our determination to get retribution. I mean, we seemed incapable of delinking Saddam Hussein from Afghanistan and Osama bin Laden, and that was wrong. But no, to come back to your original question, I'm very proud of my military service. I wear my medals with honour. I accept that is not a view that is shared by everybody politically, especially on the political left. they don't necessarily see the thing. Yeah, one of my proudest moments, if you ask me what was the time in my army career that I found the most satisfying, it was leading a multinational force in Sierra Leone in 2015 during the Ebola crisis, where we were working with the international community, with the World Health Organization, CDC, the Sierra Leone government to bring about an end to Ebola and to save lives, to save tens of thousands of lives. I didn't carry a gun. That was a humanitarian mission, and a lot of what we do in the military is about a humanitarian mission. So, you can hear me. I'm really passionate I'm passionate about the armed forces. I'm not always passionate about our political masters' decisions to commit us to campaigns. And this is where we've got to separate things. And I'm often asked, isn't it disgusting, Charlie, that the Royal Air Force have been flying missions over Gaza, since October the 7th? Yeah, it is. But don't beat up the pilots that are doing that. Don't beat them up. Beat up the government. That's a political decision to do that. Now, that doesn't mean that some of those pilots shouldn't have a moral courage to say, I think this is wrong. I don't think we should be doing this. And many people should resign. And I'm dismayed. I'm dismayed at how few people have resigned from the Foreign Office, from the MOD, from other government departments, those working for I find it extraordinary that there haven't been more resignations in protest at these extraordinary, largely illegal government decisions over the last couple of years. I'm often asked about that, and I can't explain it.
Okay, so there's two things I want to just touch on. So the one is, you mentioned it's difficult. I mean, you're not sure why people are resigning. You've been an army officer, so I'm sure it's difficult for people to resign. They obviously, there's a financial reason primarily, probably. They have an idea of service. There's an idea, probably they're hoping that things will change. They're doing this horrible thing right now, but next year they'll be on a humanitarian mission, or at some point in the future. So just, speak a bit to that, and then I'll hold the other question for later, so you don't get confused with both questions.
Yeah, it's very easy for me to stay here, and I said recently in the media, I would have resigned over this. It's easy for me to say that. I'm no longer, in the military. I've got a large pension. It's very easy for me to say that. When you've got a mortgage and you've got, young children, it's a very kind of different thing to do. But I still think people could be more outspoken. I really do. I know privately there's a lot of dismay with the UK political mission in New York to the United Nations. They disagreed with a lot of government policy. I've got friends over there, and I heard a lot of comments, a lot of muttering about this. They didn't agree with the decisions that were being taken. They didn't necessarily agree in which way in which the UN was voting in the UN Security Council and the UN General Assembly. And it did kind of surprise me that more people, even just whistleblowers, I'm surprised we haven't seen more of this. There have been a few, but I'm surprised there hasn't been more, to be quite honest. This comes down to having moral courage to do what's right. To be quite honest, and I don't necessarily think there's been enough of that.
Okay, the other one's on Afghanistan. Now, I completely agree that the Taliban are an organization and institution that should not be in charge of Afghanistan. It should not have been in charge of Afghanistan back in 2001, or I think it was like 92 or 91 when they actually came to power. And they have really created a lot of upheaval and destroyed large parts of on the whole, large parts of Afghan society. The US-UK invasion of 20 years also did that, right? So what do you think was, because you say there was lots of strategic errors with what happened in Afghanistan, and mentioned the same with Iraq. But before we get to Iraq, with Afghanistan, did you not see that while the Taliban are this horrible institution, US and UK or whoever else is coming into Afghanistan to kind of fix that are going to be seen as this invading colonial other entity, and are going to be resisted by almost all parts of society, if not physically, then at least emotionally or psychologically, and that will inevitably not be productive?
Yeah, I think there's a degree of hubris and flawed assumptions in our planning. When we went into Afghanistan in late 2001, nobody at that time said, hey, this is going to be a 20 to 30 year campaign. At its height, we're going to have 150,000 coalition soldiers in Afghanistan. Nobody anticipated that. This was really about dismantling Al-Qaeda, capturing or killing bin Laden. In order to do that, one had to achieve regime change of the Taliban. And then I think the planning assumptions at the time is that, we would then hand over to an Afghan force and everything would do. Where it all kind of went wrong was Bonn Agreement, I think, took place about 18 months, didn't it? After 18 months, 2 years. And the Taliban were not invited to those talks. And we all know that if you don't talk to your enemies, the outcome is not going to be the one which we saw. So the Taliban were excluded, and then the Taliban, largely at that point, probably down in southern Afghanistan and across the border in Pakistan, were able to kind of reconstitute. And we never really addressed genuine Pashtun grievances of the South and genuine grievances of the Taliban. And we helped to create a government under Hamid Karzai that didn't address the root causes of a problem, but allowed the Taliban to come to power back in 1996. So there were big mistakes here. For the first couple of years, it was relatively peaceful, and we had very small numbers of international soldiers in Afghanistan. I went out there in late 2002, early 2003. We probably had no more than about 300 or 400 British soldiers there at the time. We were all based in Kabul. And the country was relatively peaceful. It was all looking relatively positive at that time. I think the mistake was that we believed that we could extend the writ of Hamid Karzai beyond Kabul. He was nicknamed the Mayor of Kabul because he didn't really have it. The original power brokers, the strong men, were running Herat and Kandahar and places, Mazar-e Sharif, etc. And the sort of, I think the hubris, the sort of flawed social experiment was that we could create this enormous nation-building program in support of Hamid Karzai and his government, and we could effectively rebuild the whole of Afghanistan and turn it into a model democracy in that part of the world. And that was a deeply flawed assumption. And I think that came about because of the hubris of the 1990s and a number of successful interventions that had taken place, from Macedonia and Sierra Leone and places like that. So there's a sort of very, very flawed assumptions, but they were well-meaning assumptions, to be quite honest. And then, of course, where we all went wrong, where everybody went wrong, is in 2003 we were very distracted by the war in Iraq. We all took our eye off the ball in Afghanistan, and the US, the UK and all of her allies just became more and more ingrained in Iraq. So by sort of 2004, 2005, we had two campaigns going on concurrently, and nobody wants that. That's just not a strategic, clever way to operate. And all of the resource, all of the political effort, all of the forces were being sent to Iraq. And Afghanistan was kind of largely ignored at a time when it was really critical. And that did allow the Taliban to kind of reconstitute. By the time that we had started to expand the numbers of troops, we had expanded and we were trying to extend the writ of governance into places like Mazar in the north, Herat in the west, Kandahar in the southwest. By that time, the Taliban were resurgent. I mean, you are absolutely right. What we got fundamentally wrong is we made this our war. By piling in more and more Western troops. And you are absolutely right in what you say. They were always going to be unacceptable to a very, very traditional conservative group of people, particularly in southern Afghanistan. Always going to be unacceptable. They were unacceptable during the Russian period, in the Russian occupation, and they were unacceptable during the 2000s. And to a certain extent, as we tried to expand democracy and governments and rule of law around the country, we created the insurgency, which eventually defeated us. By 2010, everybody realised that the insurgency, the Taliban were massively resurgent, and that this was an unwinnable war. And by that time, Hamid Karzai's government was so deeply corrupt. But actually, many ordinary Afghans, started to think maybe the Taliban are not such a bad example. Maybe they're not quite so awful. Given the choice between a deeply corrupt government-paid policeman or the Taliban, maybe we should have the Taliban back. We stayed there for too long, one says with hindsight. I didn't think that when I was there in 2010. I, like many others, I could see some indicators of progress. I could see schools opening. I could see girls being educated. I could see the economy booming. What I couldn't see is all the deep fracture lines and all the rest of that. And that all became much more apparent in 2021. So it was a deeply flawed campaign, and had we left in 2002, 2003, it'd be really, I don't know what would have happened. Worst case is the Taliban would have come back in 2003, but hey, they're back anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting, just hearing your answer, is that I can see the sincerity in your own sort of mind and the clarity, and I'm sure in most of your colleagues also, about we are going there, we are going to try to, do some sort of nation building. I just think there's lots of skepticism from anyone who is not part of the former colonies, but the former colonized rather, who are previously colonized and not were part of the colonizers, who think about this and say, it's not that the society is socially conservative and they're rejecting you. They're rejecting you because you're an outsider.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter what you are or what your intentions are or what our own problems are, unless we really, really need you and are asking for you, we are probably going to resist you across the society. And obviously what you want resisted across the society because the nature of deal broking and society is like that. But invariably the society will reject you, and it's very difficult, especially in Afghanistan. You're a military person, so you know this more than me. It's a very complicated place, lots of tricky terrain, massive country, very big country. I think people don't realize just how big it is. So it's very difficult to actually hold down a force there. And I suppose it speaks to a broader question, which we'll probably come to after we discuss Iraq and then go back to probably discussing Gaza. It's about sort of the prism of the colonized versus the colonizer. But okay, Iraq, there's a lot of agreement almost across the board now among experts, among everyone else, about what happened in Iraq. The cost of Iraq, though, is borne by Iraqis, some would argue also Syrians, and the region as a whole, because some would argue that Israel's impunity extends to the fact that the US behaved with restrained impunity in Iraq. I'd compared to Israel, absolutely. But it unleashed an impunity by other actors that we saw in Syria and we saw in Iraq itself, which has now become, if you hear Douglas Murray, you hear people who defend Israel, they're like, people are getting killed in Iraq and they're getting killed in Syria and they're getting killed in Yemen. So what if 70,000 people, they don't exactly say this, but the thinking is, so what if 70 or 80,000 people have been killed in Gaza? Life in the Arab world is cheap. But it's that sort of, and it's true, like there were wars going on in that region for a long time, but there's this renewed impunity of action that is deep because of US interference. And some would argue UK interference over the last 200 years that has caused a lot of instability in the region, caused a lot of wars, not the sole reason for the wars and instability. And it's kind of in the perception of those who can hold Western governments to power, it's made Arab life or brown life a bit cheap. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's heartbreaking to hear you say that, but I don't disagree with any of your analysis there, to be quite honest. Yeah, I think the global South has lost all confidence, in Europe and the United States as a result of what happened. And you're absolutely right, it goes back 20-something years to 2003 and the invasion of Iraq.
And some would argue 91. Some would argue the funding the Iraq and Iran war from 18 to 88.
One can keep going back.
Yes.
The creation of Israel in 1948.
Yes.
Others would kind of create a sort of big colonial experiment. We can't undo history. It's kind of there. I think what we've got to do is learn the lessons from history and make sure that we don't continue and perpetuate the same sort of mistakes. And it worries me because I was going to sort of say to you, look, I think the era of intervention by Western nations is well and truly over. I think we learned our lessons for mistakes of Afghanistan and Iraq, but of course we then perpetuated the same mistake in Libya in 2010, 2011, and we've broken in Libya. So I'm not sure we have necessarily learned the lessons. But there's a danger here, though, that the pendulum swings completely the other way. And there are times when I think powerful Western nations have a responsibility to protect. I believe in this. It's not a very popular term now, this R2P, this concept, this idea that states have a responsibility to protect people from their own governments at certain places, and therefore there are times where there is a legal basis for an intervention, not even necessarily with a UN Security Council resolution. That was the basis really in which we went into Libya. And of course, because that R2P was so misused in Libya, that prevented, I think, the West from taking any meaningful action to prevent some of the atrocities that were committed in Syria during the civil war. And to a certain extent, I glibly chucked something on social media a year ago and said, where is the responsibility to protect the people of Gaza? when are the European nations are going to say, what about R2P doctrine? What about R2P international law? We have a responsibility to protect these people. And people just kind of laughed at it and just said, no, R2P is well and truly dead. And it is. And I just kind of think this whole period, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, and particularly the West's complicity in Israel's genocide in Gaza has fatally undermined any kind of credibility the West had. And it has fatally undermined any credibility in the global institutions, which I once held dear. This idea of a rules-based international order, which we now means, a US-based rules-based order. It's as simple as that, as and what the US was. And I'm not surprised, as a South African, I can understand your view. South African stance is absolutely brilliant. But South Africa's not an outlier, is it? I suspect if you were to go out and lobby and poll the global South, they'll all tell you that the West is just morally bankrupt, and its support for Israel is just totally discredited in the eyes, and therefore it's discredited in the eyes of the UN General Assembly. Some of the decisions that have been made by the US and the UK, the way in which we voted in the UN General Assembly and the UN Security Council, the UN Security Council has got to be reformed. It's got to be reformed. It has to be. I don't know how it will be, but it's we can't change the past. But we're not in a kind of great position at the moment. And what I find sort of staggering is this sort of gross hypocrisy, where we seem to think that we have an inherent right to criticise Russia and Russians' action in Ukraine. And I think Russians' actions in Ukraine are abhorrent and they are illegal. But how can we have the hypocrisy of criticising and condemning Russia when we're so prepared to support Netanyahu and Israel in Gaza? Is it any wonder we don't really have any credibility from the global South when we do that?
Where do you think, you mentioned that it was in the inevitably realpolitik that Israel would have said that it's going to defend itself and responded militarily to October 7th, but then they needed to be doing that alongside a diplomatic part. What would you have done?
What do I think the Israeli response should have been?
Yeah.
God, I'm not an expert.
Some would argue
I could tell you what I wouldn't do is, I wouldn't sit there in the cabinet and say, well, the only solution is a military one, and we're going to go in and we're going to destroy Hamas through military action alone, and we're going to bring about a better peace. That's complete and utter nonsense. What I would say is, we need to sort of try and adopt a long-term political solution to this problem that in which a military instrument is one line of operation, but it's got to be diplomatic, it's got to be economic. I talk a little bit about Northern Ireland occasionally in the media, and I don't want to draw analogies between Northern Ireland and Gaza because they're trite, but the process that we went through, it took 30 years from 1969 to 1999 to bring about a political solution in Northern Ireland. And the military instrument was just one small part of that. That political agreement ultimately came about because we addressed the root causes of the conflict. And they were about civil rights. They were about economical inequality. They were about injustice of the Roman Catholics in Northern Ireland. It was about housing. It was about jobs. And when all of that was addressed, we got to a political solution. And that's the only thing that's going to bring about, in my view, a long-term solution in Israel. You cannot view Gaza in isolation. You cannot. Gaza is just one constituent part of what ultimately one day has got to be a Palestinian state. And if you just view Gaza in isolation, you're just hitting it. You're hitting a hammer with a nail, and you're not looking at the wider problem that you're trying to kind of deal with. And that's kind of so kind of what should be done. Yeah, I would have said, look, let's have kind of some kind of supercharged counter-terrorist response in Gaza against Hamas, which is a counter-terrorist campaign which is prosecuted within the law. It's prosecuted with distinction. It doesn't target civilians, and it is proportional to the response. It targets Hamas, and it's not going to deal with Hamas. It's not going to destroy Hamas, but it's going to attrit Hamas to a level that it is not capable of doing another 7th of October. And we'll keep doing that. We'll keep doing that, maybe for 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 or 10 years' time, because in parallel, we're going to supercharge a political track that brings about a long-term political solution to the problem with Palestine and Israel statehood. That's what I would have done. Easy for me to kind of say, I don't know what it looks like, and really difficult with this particular coalition government in Israel. But until they do this, until they are prepared to look at the whole and not just look at Hamas, until they do that, then they're just going to carry on, smashing away, banging away at the nail. But as I said earlier, I think that's part of their strategic approach. Yeah, it suits them to have a perpetual conflict, a forever war.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, the key, because I've also grappled with this question for a long time on, one state or two states, and then there's the examples of Northern Ireland and South Africa. And I think the first departure point with Israel Palestine and the UK Northern Ireland is that both parties wanted a solution that was political. And I think in the departure point in Israel Palestine is Israel doesn't want a political solution. And so before we get into the tactical situation of should they do this or should they do that, fundamentally the paradigm that the Israelis are coming at this for the last 40 years, obviously there's variant differences, but on the whole for the last 40 years compared to the UK government is that the Israeli solution is a non-solution. Whereas the UK wanted, maybe, of course, there were various prime ministers or various interest groups wanted, a solution at a certain price, but wanted a solution. And I think with the apartheid government, it's almost the same. It's that by the time the 80s came and the 90s came, they realized that they would lose power. They realized they would be isolated. They realized that it was in their interests, or at least to come to some sort of situation, and they could maintain it. And I think that's the fundamental difference. I also think, and this is just out of interest, that I used to, South Africa is a great example of a one-state solution. And when this conflict, the most recent part of it, the most iteration, when the genocide was unleashed, I was like, okay, it seems now that one-state solution, there's just too much animosity. But at the same time, now there's 800,000 settlers living in what would be a Palestinian state. So the two-state solution is also not feasible. And Israel's actions now, where they are pushing for ethnic cleansing, it's almost like both solutions aren't on the table. And there could be blowback because there's the Arab world is becoming increasingly fragmented. There are 400 million Arabs, though, who to some extent, feel affinity with the Palestinians and others don't. But at the whole, Israel is the implant. And they've made themselves more so the implant. They haven't really, on the whole, they had an opportunity for 8 years where they could integrate with the region, where they could become friendly neighbors. Obviously, there's been some blame on the Arab side as well, especially in the first 20 years where they, saw Israel as this entity. But Israel hasn't helped the situation. And it's almost difficult to see any solution outside of massive violence. And at the moment, Palestinians being the victim of that violence, but the inevitability that there may come a point where the wheel turns.
Yeah, Israeli opposition to a solution is always a problem. But I think your South African analogy is a really kind of good one. Apartheid era South Africa didn't necessarily want a solution in the 1970s, but eventually it found itself completely globally isolated, didn't it? Huge economic sanctions and all the rest of it. It was forced into finding a solution, is that correct? Yeah. It was forced by international pressure. Israel could be compelled to be forced to find a solution to the Arab-Israeli conflict issue, to this question of Palestinian state. It could be. It's whether or not we're willing to do that. And the United States is clearly the key player in this. But there are other European nations that need to kind of play a part in this. And at the moment, we're not willing to. And until the international community, the West, is willing to compel Israel to do this, as you say, we're not going to get a solution. That's depressing, but that's a kind of reality.
No, it's true. Do you see that do you see that the international community, Israel has literally behaved beyond people's imagination in the last 2 years. I think if I asked you when you started becoming extremely disgusted back in January 2024, can you imagine that this is going to be what the next 20 months are like? You'd probably be like, no, it won't be that bad. And I think most people were of that orientation. And yet they still, by and large, have a lot of support, a lot of international support. It is decreasing, but not. They're still getting money and they're still getting weapons, and they're still getting complicity in some of the military activities, as we mentioned, right? So, do you see that support sort of diminishing in any way? Because bear in mind that there is strategic interest, one some could argue, behind having Israel in where it is, because it kind of diminishes the ability of the Arab world to just kind of, gain its own feet, slowly build representative government, slowly build a broad civil society. Because at the moment, what you have in the Arab world is you have Israel behaving as we know they are behaving, and then authoritarian governments that have the support of the US, and other authoritarian governments that get their credibility by opposing the US. And I'm not saying that's by US design. One could argue it could be, but irrespective of whether it's by US design or not, it does mean that the US strategic interest possibly is fulfilled in that region because the region's depleted, and so they have time to use them as a depleted entity, or not use them but rely on them for support against China or against Russia or against any other entity.
Super geostrategic. I mean, the optimist in me would like to think that an ICJ ruling that Israel is or has committed genocide would be sufficient to change international support for Israel. The optimist in me suggests that it would do. The realist in me suggests that it'll be largely ignored, and all the United States will do and others will do is just seek to discredit the ICJ. So I'm not sure that international law, sadly, is going to play any kind of part in this. So no, as I say, I think it's kind of really difficult. Trump will move on. Who knows what happens with the next US administration? I think the research in China, I think, is going to continue to preoccupy the United States. You already see, Russia, Ukraine is now, that's where the media attention is. That's where Trump's attention is. And this is why I think the real danger, I think, is that we end up with a frozen conflict. It's not really a frozen conflict.
It's a conflict, atrocity.
Yeah, what one might call a low-intensity conflict, where international journalists are not able to enter Gaza, not going to be, because they will be able to see the atrocities that are going on. The Israeli Defense Forces will continue to occupy 53% of Gaza and will continue to surge into the other 47% at will, as and when they want. There'll be very limited reconstruction, and it will just end up as a low-level continued operation. So for the Palestinians inside Gaza, it's way worse than it was on the 7th of October, or on the 6th of October. It's weird. It's a proper occupation. That's my prediction as to where this is going to go. I'm not optimistic that this is going to end in anywhere better over the next couple of years. I think it's just going to be a kind of a low-level conflict. And it's heartbreaking. I can't believe I'm calling it a low-level conflict where 30, 40, 50 Palestinians are being killed every single day. That's not low-level if you're living inside Gaza. That's existential. But as soon as the Western media, and as soon as our eye is off this, it'll just kind of continue. I think that's kind of where it's going. And we've missed this opportunity to bring about some kind of fundamental change, to bring about some kind of long-term solution. By gosh, it's needed.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think I completely agree with you that Israel will continue. I don't believe that any ruling by the ICJ will significantly, unfortunately, realistically change the way that the big powers and Israel are behaving. Although it will become embarrassing and it will weigh a lot when it probably doesn't matter anymore in history. But I mean, you mentioned sort of the stalemate and this low-level continued atrocity/conflict. 90% of all the buildings in Gaza have been completely demolished or destroyed or damaged in some way. We all see the images. Winter is coming. There's a shortage of tents. I think I read somewhere that there's 30,000 tents and people need 300,000 tents, which by math would say there's about 2 million people in Gaza. Or maybe there's less. But there probably is, because that's the numbers according to what we have in terms of who's left and who's been killed. And even that tells you that 6 people to a tent, without infrastructure, with limited food. I don't know no one understands the sanitary situation, the amount of disease that could be going around. It kind of seems like it's almost already very, very difficult, if not impossible, to just hold back a massive campaign which could, either by military force or other means, lead to a lot more death, and lead to, in my mind, I'm like, this is, sometimes I think that if you just take the actual reality of the situation, it's very sad, but Gaza is possibly already gone.
Yeah. I mean, where do the people go? I miss the heartbreaking kind of thing. I think you're right. I think they're going to exist for a period of time in the most extraordinarily uncomfortable conditions, exactly as you described. I mean, it's savage. It's absolutely savage, and we're complicit in it. We'll go on training Israeli soldiers in the UK. I read a report yesterday that we've had soldiers training in Israel over the last couple of years. We'll go on buying millions and millions of pounds worth of Israeli weapons every year, and we'll just turn a blind eye and pretend it isn't happening. And exactly as you say, 2 million people will live in abject poverty. Yeah, I don't have an answer to it.
Yeah.
But where a brutal occupation occurs, then armed resistance will always continue, and it will grow, and Israel will, they'll cut off the flow of arms and material into Gaza. They've probably kind of done that by occupying that southern border with Egypt. So the ability of the Palestinians in Gaza to resist this occupation will be reduced, inevitably. But their long-term hatred and their determination to resist, and their will to resist, will never go away. It will never go away. Israel will find itself just incapable of building effective long-term relations with its neighbours while it treats the Palestinians in the way that it does. Yeah, it's I don't want to be kind of gloomy about it, but it's difficult to be kind of optimistic about this at the moment. It really is. I think that the opportunities for optimism have sort of passed along the way over the last few years, and they seem to be kind of long gone now. Yeah, and those people who are sort of cheerleading this 20-point plan, I mean, utterly naive, simplistic view. It's just so deeply flawed.
I mean, I agree with you that it's deeply flawed, but what's your analysis on why it's flawed?
Been forced upon. It's a solution that's been forced upon the Palestinians. It is a plan that has, as far as I can tell, no support from Hamas. Actively resisting against it. The idea they've said they will not tolerate an international stabilization force. Who's going to provide, this what do we call it, a board of peace chaired by Trump, Tony Blair, one of the names? I mean, how is this board of peace actually going to kind of operate? How and where is the international stabilization force going to operate? Where's it going to come from? There's not going to be an international stabilization force if Hamas resist it. It's not going to happen. Nobody's going to send their troops into that kind of area where they're going to be managed by the Israelis and they're going to be managed by Hamas. So you're not going to have an international. So the very basic underpinnings, the basic mechanics of how you maintain peace are not even there. And that's before we even start to talk about kind of reconstruction, which is, is going to cost billions and billions and billions and billions. And I very much doubt that there is genuinely the political determination by neighbouring states and by the international community to fund that. So it's and what, there've been 400 ceasefire violations, and nothing happens.
Probably more.
Nothing
happens. 335 people killed since.
So what would have been a better solution? I don't know. I don't know what would have been a better solution, but I know that this is not the right solution. Better solution, and again, it's not nested within a wider political solution to the wider question of Palestinian statehood. It just sits there in isolation, this Gaza 20-point plan. And desperately in preparation for this, I'm desperately trying to research, what is happening politically and diplomatically at the moment to re-energise talks about a two-state solution. Not very much. Nothing substantial.
Nothing substantial, yeah. Okay, let's just step back away from this and go back to a young Charlie Herbert who was not yet in the army. Who were you, and what sort of motivated you to want to join the army?
Gosh, I grew up in Staffordshire, probably a relatively affluent middle class family. I had a good upbringing. I didn't particularly enjoy school. I think from the age of about 13, 14, I knew I wanted to join the army. I didn't come from a military background. My father was a businessman. And I was suspended from a couple of schools, and eventually school said, look, all he wants to do is join the army, just let him join the army. So I left school. At the start of my A-levels, I started my A-levels, but I didn't complete my A-levels, and I joined the army shortly after my 17th birthday as a soldier, which was quite unusual for somebody who then goes on to relatively high rank. And I loved it. I loved it from the kind of day that I joined. I found my niche. I found my tribe, so to speak. And after 3 or 4 years, I was offered a chance to go and do officer training, go to Royal Military Academy Sandhurst and become an officer. And I didn't think I'd necessarily stay in the army. But I loved it. And, as we discussed earlier, I thought what I was doing throughout my career was good. We used trite terms in the 1990s. I think there's this great saying that, the British Armed Forces, a force for good. People laugh at it now, but we were bought into that at the time. And I found my niche in the army, and I loved it. And as I said, travelled around the world, generally doing what I thought was good things, to a point where I got to today.
When you started as a 17-year-old soldier, did you think you'd rise up the ranks? Did you have like a plan? Like, this is my career. Like, I'm just going to take it one day at a time.
No, I've never had a plan. Wing it every day. No, I lack the imagination to have plans. No, I didn't. No, I didn't expect that I'd stay in the army for a career. When I went to Sandhurst, I thought, I'd probably do a few years as a young officer. I commissioned from Sandhurst in 1990. While I was at Sandhurst, the wall came down, the Soviet Union dissolved. It kind of looked like there wouldn't be a requirement for armed forces anymore. And I questioned whether there would be a career ahead of me, And then, of course, 1991, the Gulf War, I found I was in the Gulf War as a very young officer. And then I was in the Balkans in the 1990s, and then of course 9/11 happened, and so I never really had a kind of plan to stay in the army for any length of time. But it always interested me, and there was plenty of work, and I enjoyed it. It was a real privilege. It is a huge privilege to lead young soldiers. It really is. It might sound a bit odd to you, but it is a remarkable privilege to be given a role where one leads at age 20, 21, 28, 29 young soldiers and more experienced soldiers. And in my view, do good. I'm very proud of my role in the Gulf War and liberating Kuwait of an occupying force. Very, very proud. It's a short war, but I thought, wow, if this doesn't happen, what happens? Sometimes to me, it was kind of really good use of the military instruments. You had a UN Security Council resolution. You had global support for that campaign. It was very exciting as a 21-year-old to be involved in that kind of war. It wasn't a particularly bloody war. It was over very shortly, or the ground war was over very, very quickly. I did see extraordinary loss of life on the Iraqi side, and one doesn't ever forget that. Conflict does come at a huge cost. War does come at a huge cost. And I saw that again in the Balkans in the early 1990s. That was a kind of real wake-up call for me. I had this vision. And I talk to people about conflict and war studies nowadays. And at every few years, you were learning more throughout my career. Bosnia was a real kind of learning experience to see how war affects the civilian population. And we ignore that sometimes. We tend to think of war as a battle between two opposing forces, and if it's fought in the deserts, as the Gulf War was, that's largely what it is. But when it's fought in Sarajevo or in Travnik or in Gaza or in Damascus or in Homs, it's war amongst the people, and the people that suffer are women and children in particular. And it's a horrendous experience to kind of be involved in that. And anybody who has been involved in that kind of conflict hates war and just wants to see it over. And sometimes I think politicians do commit the armed forces to war without really understanding the consequences of it. But
what was it that sort of, what thing that did you do in the army that made them say, okay, let's make this man a major general?
Wow. I suppose I didn't mess up too badly along the way. Maybe I was a little bit too vanilla. I didn't upset anybody enough. It's a good question. I don't know. It's an interesting era. I had a relatively conventional career. Weirdly, I really enjoyed being on operations. I enjoyed going overseas on challenging operations. So I spent a lot of my time volunteering to go to Iraq, to go to Afghanistan, to go to Sierra Leone, to go to I wanted to do that. Whereas lots of other people are more happy working in the Ministry of Defence or Army headquarters or working in a procurement job or finance role. And I suppose I was very lucky that I had those opportunities. And over a period of time, I was promoted. Don't get me wrong, it wasn't because I was particularly good at my job. I guess I was just incredibly fortunate. But yeah, I rose up through a variety of command positions. I commanded a company of 100 soldiers on 2 tours in Iraq in middle 2000s. I commanded my battalion in Iraq in 2008. I commanded a battalion in Afghanistan in 2010, and those were, I suppose, both career opportunities to a certain extent, that allowed one to advance. But I was surprised as anybody, but I ended up as a major general.
And just going back, just a few more questions. Just going back to when you were 13, 14, what was the appeal? Was it the institution of the army? Was there a political appeal? You wanted to get, wanted to make sure the Russians don't take over the world? Like, what was the?
Funny. I think probably the greatest influence was the Falklands War in 1982, when I was probably about 13, and it was a relatively straightforward conflict between two nations, but wasn't really fought amongst the people. It was fought a very long way away. It was a joint campaign with a task force. It had a UN Security Council resolution. It was all right, and it was a sort of conflict that was quite appealing to a young man. Here's the British Army doing great things, in direct support, restoring sovereignty to the United Kingdom. It was all, And I was inspired by people like Lieutenant Colonel H. Jones, who lost his life in the Falklands while commanding 2-Power, in what I saw was an extraordinary act of leadership and self-sacrifice. And so I was inspired by things like that. Maybe it's a bit gung-ho as one looks back at it, but I think the Falklands had a very significant impact on me at that time, and it playing out on the news every night and reading the newspapers, and I was aware of what was going on. My cousin was a few years older than me. He went into the army. He went in as an army officer probably when I was about 14. I think that was another sort of factor. But I think I was just, to a certain extent, kind of looking for a home that suited me. I liked the idea. At that time in the 1980s, most of the army was overseas in Germany, to be quite honest. We had other bases in Gibraltar and Hong Kong and Central America, etc. But the bulk of the army was in Germany, and it was facing off against a very clear enemy, which was the Soviet Union. So it was kind of there was a clarity and a unity of purpose about it that very much appealed to me. And I enjoyed being in an institution that so I talked about earlier, an institution that had very firm values and standards and beliefs and integrity. So the term integrity ran through officer training. I really believed in that, and it appealed to me. And I don't get me wrong, I still miss the army. I left in 2019 after 34 years. I miss the unity of purpose that we had. I miss this can-do sense that one found in the military. I miss this sense of teamwork and camaraderie, of people pulling in the right direction. I don't find that very often outside of the military, to being honest. So it's why I do. I still hold the institution dear. It's not without its flaws. The armed forces, like any large institution, is imperfect. And the fact that the army is 350 years older, certain things, traditions and history does hold it back to a certain extent.
And if you could imagine yourself being 13 or 14 in 2005, 2025, or 15 or 16, how do you think you'd still, like, if you were a kid right now, a 14-year-old kid, do you think you'd want to join the army? And if not, why not?
It's a great question. I feel if I said no, but I probably wouldn't join that. That's only because over my lifetime there are other things that I've seen that kind of really appeal to me. I mentioned that time that I was in Sierra Leone during Ebola, and I saw the incredible work of infectious disease doctors, specialists who devoted their entire life to dealing with things like viral hemorrhagic fevers in Africa. And I've got an extraordinary respect for professional healthcare workers. I think if I went back to being 13, the conversation that I have with myself would be work hard at school, dedicate yourself, and perhaps go into something like that rather than the military. There's no particular reason why I wouldn't. But the military has changed. When I joined in 1985, there were probably about 170,000 people in the army. There's now probably about 70,000. It's a much smaller. It's nearly all UK based. It's less clear now. There's less of an existential threat to the United Kingdom. 10 years ago, we were talking about that threat being terrorism. Now we're talking about that threat being a resurgent Russia. So it's kind of less clear. So I don't know if the army would have the same appeal to me. I certainly wouldn't have any objections to it from a sort of ethical or a philosophical basis. I still believe that those young men and women, increasingly women, that's a big change in my lifetime, but those young men and women who go into the army go in for the right reasons and have a real sense of duty and loyalty and service to their country. And I wish we could just kind of, we struggle a bit. The military, I say we, as if I'm still in the military. It's interesting. It's hard to get away from that. I wish the military could kind of more appeal to society in 2025. I think it is less appealing to young people of today. And I think the army, it does great work, in particular trying to attract from the BAME community. It really does. The army wants to be, armed forces, they want to be ethnically diverse. They want to represent society, but they are really struggling to attract from that cohort. But it's not for want of trying. And I really wish that they could crack this, because the armed forces will only be correct and right, and only be representative when they genuinely represent society in that regards.
Okay, just final reflection, which is a response to what you said, and then to get your reflection. But I mean, you've seen, because you are, I guess from a military experience, but also before that, you are definitely into the news. You follow the news closely. And as a result of following the news, you have developed views which are extremely critical of Israel. Do you think, as a 14-year-old, you would have been on Instagram and TikTok and seeing Middle East Eye and Al Jazeera as well, and that would have been like, no, I'll never join the army because these guys are complicit in the genocide?
That's a great question. Yeah, I'd have been disappointed. Yeah, if I was on Instagram reading, if I was reading Charlie Herbert's Twitter feed, X feed, I don't want to be part of any organisation that supports that. Yeah, it's interesting. Young people today, I thought young people today were all super politically aware, and they're not, are they? I mean, I've got a 16 and 19-year-old. My 19-year-old is becoming increasingly politically aware. And she, over the last 2 years, has really started to take an interest in the world around her, which is really encouraging. And she's at Bristol University studying sociology. And she's becoming kind of really politically aware, and I think increasingly left-wing in her views, which I'm loving. My boy is 16 and he just still lives for Chelsea Football Club, and I'm dismayed at his lack of political interest in the world around him. We've got to get young people interested in politics. But somebody described my journey as my political awakening. I can't remember if it was Owen Jones or Matt Kennell or somebody. and it's really interesting because I suspect, at 21, I was probably centre-right, my political leanings. Now I'm increasingly left-wing in my views. And actually, that's been a sort of gradual awakening. And not necessarily shared by many. A lot of people say to me, a lot of ex-veterans say to me, how come you're so left-wing, Charlie? It doesn't make sense. You're a retired general. I go, no, don't worry, I want a two of us for things like that. I want a two of us that vote for the Green Party, etc. Interesting journey.
Sorry, I know I said that this will be the last question, but now this is the last question. Have you, and you don't have to give me names or anything, but have you actually fallen out with some of your veteran friends due to views on Gaza?
I wouldn't say friends. There are those who I battle with on social media, big prolific names. Richard Kemp. I despise Richard Kemp's political views on social media. He's very involved in a IDF supporting charity. He seems to have become a spokesman for the Daily Telegraph. I abhor the fact that he and I served in the same military, to be quite honest. I find that really distasteful. There's another chap who I'm not going to name because we had a very public spat on social media, former parachute regiment officer. I don't understand his views. We fall out. We're just diametrically opposed. But what I don't get, this isn't about politics. This isn't about it's about the law. It's really, and it keeps coming back to this. What the IDF have done again and again and again and again is unlawful. It's as simple as that. It's binary. It's really simple. You commit war crimes when you shoot detainees after they've surrendered. That is unlawful. That shouldn't be open to debate and judgment, subjectivity. It's unlawful. And I think the IDF's actions in Gaza over the last 2 years have been deeply unlawful. And how anybody can support that staggers me.
Major General Charlie Herbert, thank you for your time.
No, bless you. Thank you very much indeed.